Welcome to Pod Central. This is the podcast that we have of Central Baptist Church Jacksonville members. The idea behind it is we get to know each other better. And one of the people that I know extremely well, because she's my mother-in-law, is Barbara McBride. Barbara's got a great story to tell from her past, but here recently, Barbara was named the Senior Adult Woman of the Year, and I thought, what better an opportunity than to bring Barbara in the studio and let everybody else get to know Barbara in a more intimate, close manner. So, Barbara, welcome to Pod Central.
Well, thank you, Joe. I really don't know that I have anything that's very interesting to say that people would really want to listen to, but thank you for inviting me in.
Well, we're glad. Okay, Becky told me I have to do it. Go back to your childhood. Tell us where you were born and tell us a little bit about your early years.
Okay, well, I have kind of a beginning here locally. I was born in Turney. Back when Turney was actually a city on the map, there was a post office and stores,
Really?
and the train I actually rode the train one time from Dallas to Turney.
Really?
The passenger train stopped at Turney to let passengers off. Few people know that about, because Turney is not much.
Now, see, I'm learning something already. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
So
Anyway, but when I was still an infant, my parents moved away. This was prior to World War II, and it was after the Great Depression that we've all read about in the history books.
Right.
And so for job opportunities, my family moved to Southern California.
Southern California. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And tell us more about exactly where.
Okay. Oh, you want to know? Okay.
I know the answer.
Yes,
I've got to be able to.
Okay, sometimes when I'm giving my testimony, children particularly are interested in the fact when I say that I used to live in Disneyland. Obviously, this was way before Walt Disney ever had the idea of making a theme park, but we did live in Anaheim, California, where today Disneyland is located. So somewhere I've been out there since several times to Disneyland, and I've really tried to figure out where, in that big
what roller
theme
coaster.
Park,
yeah.
I don't know if I lived in Frontierland or Adventureland or wherever, but anyway, yes, I used to live there. And anyway, my early years were spent in Anaheim, there in the LA area.
Okay, but pretty soon after that, you moved to the Dallas area, where you spent the remainder of your childhood?
Yes, the war had started, and my dad was in defense work.
And this is Daddy George, what we call Daddy George, but everybody else in the church, there's a lot of people that remember him as Wendell Perry.
Yes, he was a member at Central for the last few years of his life, yes,
Right.
when he lived in Jacksonville then.
Yes.
He moved back after my mom died. Anyway, he had started in defense work. He worked for McDonnell Douglas. Being an aviator,
Yes.
you might be familiar with McDonnell Douglas.
Absolutely.
They had a lot of government contracts in those days building warplanes. And so he was exempt, therefore, from the draft and did not have to go to war.
But he contributed, for sure.
Yes. And so my mother got a little bit nervous about, being in the war. Would you like to hear some of my early remembrances
Yeah, sure.
of
Yes,
that?
I'd love to.
Well, the West Coast being quite close to Japan, and Japan having done what they did at Pearl Harbor, people would sometimes be very nervous.
Right.
And that was before the days of radar, and so at night, particularly when airplanes flying over would cause nervousness on the part of many people. And so we would have blackouts. I remember I was very young, but it was kind of an interesting, scary kind of thing when the sirens would go off, which meant all lights had to be turned out. Nobody had yard lights, porch lights. You even turned your house lights off or street lights and all that. And we would go outside sometimes and watch the proceedings. And what they would do is have these huge, big, what do you call those, big spotlights,
Yeah.
Which you seldom ever see anymore. You used to see them when the circus or something
Right.
would come to town, and I've not seen one of those, going across the sky in the dark for
Right.
a long time now. But they would have those, and I remember stand and watch as they would, just go all over the black sky looking for the airplane because they could not tell whether it was friend or enemy
Right.
until they actually saw it.
Right.
Which is really strange. I mean, nowadays it seems very,
We would know.
We've come a long way, yeah. Anyway, that was one remembrance I have of those early days. But anyway, my mother wanted to move back nearby family. So we moved back to Texas during the war, while the war was still in progress, actually.
Oh, okay.
When we moved back to Dallas, my dad took a job with a company who later became Lingtim Covalt. People today know it as LTV, but he was still involved in the aircraft industry. Anyway, and so we lived, or I did, had the rest of my childhood and growing up years in the Dallas area, and that's where I went to school. And you graduated from a Dallas high school.
And then when you graduated Dallas High School, you went to college immediately, or did you wait a couple years?
No, I did not. I was only 16 when I graduated from high school because back in those days, they would double promote people. That is a thing of the past anymore. But if you could do the work, they'd just put you in the grade level where
so
you
fit.
So you were advanced. Well, I don't know about that. Maybe in some ways, and in some ways, maybe I was probably very far behind. I know I wasn't ready to leave Mama and go to college.
But when you did go to college, where'd you end up going?
I went to Howard Payne.
For all 4 years?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And at Howard Payne, you met a man.
I did.
Tell us about your man, and tell us a few stories from those early days.
I was a music major, and Dan McBride was also a music major, and so we got to know each other. And he was sort of a big man on campus, you might say. Everybody knew him because he had been singing professionally on television in the Dallas area for a number of years. During his high school years, he appeared on a weekly television show singing and playing. So he would often get asked to, sing on school assemblies and for programs and various things. So anyway, people knew who he was. And anyway, so we met, and one time he asked me, the first time he ever asked me for a date, he asked me to go to church with him one Sunday night.
Really? To church for a date?
To church for our first date. And I said, yes, I'd be glad to. Only after I agreed to go did I find out he had been asked to sing and needed an accompanist.
Oh, my goodness. So that wasn't much of a date, was it?
Well, actually, it was. It turned out to be fun. But that was the beginning of a lot of the way we spent our years together. He was the singer and I was his accompanist. That was, I played the piano for his singing for. And that was the beginning.
For how many years did you play? All the way. This is you'd effectively have to say from college, all the way until his death, which is in 2002.
Yes. And it would have been 45 years, I think, from the time I first played for him until he passed away. I guess I had been an accompanist for him for 45 years.
Well, I've always found it to be an interesting part as I've been a part of the family. Dan as the front man, the singer, the talker, the everything, but over off to the side is Barbara, never takes the microphone, never wants the microphone.
That's right.
and you're very happy in that position, playing the accompanist, however you'd say that, the accompanist for Dan.
Yes.
Now let's back up to college, because Dan graduated, I remember, with an MRE, which is a Master's of Religious Education, but he would call that a mighty religious entertainer.
Yeah, that was his college degree. He didn't have he got a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts, actually, both from Howard Payne. And then we went to seminary, and I did a little bit of graduate work on my master's, but I didn't finish it.
But Dan did finish. So y'all spent 6 years at Howard Payne.
No, he only got, it was, I think, 3 years. He was there for 3 years and got master's, they call that now a Master of Arts in Religious
Right.
Education. Back then, they just called it Masters of Religious Education, an MRE.
MRE.
Yeah, and yeah, well, some other, I don't remember who first said that was for the mighty religious entertainer, but,
Well,
but of course he wasn't that then.
right.
He was a very serious student, and adult education was his field, and so he started serving on churches then after that.
What you and Dan did was completely different than anybody ever did after. I mean, there's not a job description for Dan and Barbara McBride. He created his own niche, and really, I don't know that there's too many people out there doing his niche now. How did you and Dan go from this team of pianist, Dan with a guitar, him singing, and coming up with this idea to run around the country, singing at churches and poking fun at the church? How did that come?
Well, he since he'd grown up singing and people knew that he was a singer, he was often invited, to perform for occasions and functions and programs and assemblies and whatever. And that didn't stop when we were in church. And, he would be invited by other churches sometimes to come and sing. And he did a lot of youth things then. We were younger, we worked a lot with youth, although his expertise was in adult education.
His
worked
training
as
was,
youth,
right?
Yes, but he also loved doing youth work, and so he would do a lot of youth programs and functions, and learned a lot of funny songs that would appeal to young people. And then it occurred to him one time, as he was serving in the capacity of what we called Minister of Education or Education Director.
Right.
Churches you just still have those. They call them by different names, different titles. But anyway, he had first-hand knowledge of the faults and foibles and falling downs and things of people. And, people are funny. And church people are funny as
funny.
well. Sometimes, yes. And so funny things would occur, and he could write about that in song. So he started writing kind of funny things, poking fun at church people. Never anything theological or scriptural. I mean, it was always about being late to church or trying to count, trying to have pad your Sunday school attendance. Sleeping in church, yes. And so he started writing funny songs dealing with those kind of things. And he usually wrote them to public domain tunes that people would know. And he'd often parodize the song that he was using the tune for. And anyway, so they got to be kind of well known. And so people would call, people from other churches would call and say, "Hey, Dan, can you come and sing your funny songs for us?" So he started, that's kind of how it started out. First, just in the association, neighboring churches and friends' churches and nearby churches. And we were serving in the Dallas Association then. That's where our church was. And so it started within the Dallas area. And then since he was a graduate of seminary, some of his fellow seminary students, who were now serving in churches, would invite him to go. And then when, on occasion, when the educators would have, go back to seminary for convention meetings or
additional
or
training,
whatever, and they'd have need of a program, then would get invited to do those. And then that was exposure to people who had come from all over the convention to those meetings. And so then he started getting invited to go to, the churches in Georgia and Florida and Alabama and all. So that's kind of how it started.
Did y'all ever have a steady paycheck?
Well, when we were still on staff,
Right, but that was like the early 60s, and y'all literally lived 30 years.
Actually, after Dan had been invited to go all these many different places, it was taking a lot of time, too much time from his local ministry responsibilities
at the church where he was.
At the church.
Mhm.
So the first thing he did was to take like a part-time situation. We went to a small Baptist church in the Dallas Association still. We still lived in Dallas. That was convenient because he could fly in and out of DFW quite easily.
Right.
Anyway, and this was just like a Sunday, Wednesday church, but people loved having someone of his notoriety, which is on staff, and so
Sure.
they had told him, whenever you need to be gone, it's
You
fine.
just go.
Yes, and they liked reading their name in the Southern Baptist publications that,
Sure.
Dan McBride, who is,
associate pastor or
yeah,
minister
he
of
was,
education.
he was assistant pastor. Oh, and one funny thing was he said he was assistant pastor. He'd always wanted to be associate pastor because he understood that when you were associate pastor, you get to associate with the pastor. But anyway, so that's how that transpired, and then and along about this time, I guess, people from other denominations were hearing about him. And the Radio TV Commission, which was a subsidy of like the Sunday School Board way back in the Southern Baptist Convention they made recordings and albums. But the big 33 and a third, the big kind of albums back then in those days. And they had made some recordings of Dan, and those were put in bookstores all across, the country.
So people started learning of him.
So other people started hearing about him, other denominations, and I don't know if there's still an organization called the National Sunday School Association or not. Back then, it was a very large organization of all evangelical denominations, some maybe not Baptists other than Southern Baptists, but it included Methodists and Christian,
Lutheran.
the diocese of Luther. Well, yes, I don't know who all.
Yeah.
But anyway, they invited him to come do their national convention one time. So that was great exposure to these many other different denominations who had the same, Sunday school difficulties and people sleeping in church or whatever problems, that he was already singing about.
He was already making, that's exactly right.
And so it was after that then that he started getting so many invitations to go to so many other denominations all across the country that he was not doing justice at all to our little church.
So he eventually just went full-time.
So, yes. He went, So that was, okay, I'm sorry it takes me forever to tell anything. That was in answer to your question about several minutes ago about income. When we left, resigned that little part-time church, that is when we entered into a faith ministry.
Which was effectively back in the 1960s. I mean, we're... It was. Yes, it was. Yeah. So a long time, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean,
so
30 plus
during
years.
All those, yes, I think it was 35 years we didn't have like a regular income, or we depended on God to provide for us.
And God did provide.
He did more than we would ever have thought. We never lacked for anything. We were able to rear our children in a way that I hope they didn't think was too terrible. And they all got their college degrees and everything. And we didn't have to really cut corners. And we found out that how good God is when you put all your faith and trust in Him.
I think that's one of the neat stories about the McBride family is that, so many times people in America look for security and for stability. And that's good, but I think God sometimes provides, He is the stability and the security that we need. And y'all's lives, the McBride life, your life, is a neat example of how stability and security is given by God in an apparent unstable and insecure position. But goodness sakes, 35 or 40 years on the road. I mean, I can remember Dan going to churches that were little bitty, and big too. And you never knew what was going to happen. And I can remember him singing and carrying the guitar and coming out of there, and there wouldn't be hardly any money at all. And
There were times like that, yes, but then there were other times, God evens out things, and
Right.
the bigger ones make up for the little ones. And if it were not for those little ones, we wouldn't have had opportunity to do all the travels that we did.
right, y'all hit just about every state in the union except for
I think Dan figured up one time we sang in 41 states for 15 different denominations.
wow.
And it kind of got to be a goal for us. Oh, one thing I didn't say is in summers and on weekends, on weekends when Dan wasn't going too far, and in summers, wherever he was going, our family would
Sure.
tag along. We would go with him, and so they grew up singing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it became our goal to try to go to as many states. Like if we were, traveling somewhere and we were passing nearby a state. I remember West Virginia was one of those states. I don't know that I've ever been to any big city or state any length of time in West Virginia, but we were traveling along the interstate not too far from West Virginia, and we thought if we ever get to go to West Virginia, it'll be now. So we made the little side trip, spent a little time in West Virginia,
Yeah.
and then
Took a picture by the
continued on
road
our way.
sign and
Well, probably something like that. But through the years, yes, our children did get into and travel through and spent quite a bit of time in most of the 48
Yeah.
contiguous states.
Let me back up for a minute. What brought you to Jacksonville? Y'all have been in Jacksonville now for early 70s. What made you want to come to Jacksonville?
Okay, it was in like about mid-60s when Dan had, left resigned his
regular job.
His regular, yeah, his church ministry job, and started traveling full time. And we still lived in Dallas. And I like Dallas. I still like Dallas. But back then, it wasn't really the best place to live. Particularly when he was gone so much of the time, he was traveling a lot. By then, he would be like in maybe like Kansas City one night, and Chicago the next night, and Miami the next night, and Phoenix the next night, and then maybe get home the next night or something. And so he was just crisscrossing the country, and he thought, well, he started feeling that he shouldn't go off and leave us there, in Dallas.
So you came to Jacksonville
his being there.
Yeah.
Okay. See, I had those initial roots in this, in this near Turney being, so near Jacksonville. However, by that time, my grandparents had passed on, and I didn't have really any close relatives. That's not what brought us to Jacksonville so much as my mom and dad had purchased a little house on Lake Jacksonville, and they would come to Lake Jacksonville through the summers and spend a lot of time, and we on occasion would also. So we kind of got to know Jacksonville and learn to love the area and the beauty of it. And so when we were trying to decide on a place to live outside the big busy city, Dan thought of a rural area or a small town or something. So that's how we decided Jacksonville, because we kind of had roots and knew a little bit about it already.
Sure. Okay. So you've lived in Jacksonville, basically, 5 kids, all of them graduated from Jacksonville High School. All of them went on to college. All of them have gone on to great things. And it's a neat family. I can say that because I've married into it as far as that's concerned. 2002 came along, and there was a sad day when Dan passed. Since that time, I guess what I want to know is, tell me about what the Lord's done in your life since that time. What's life like? Because in 2002, Dan was vibrant and going and strong and singing. He was all over the country still. And then all of a sudden that just stopped. And you changed gears completely, and I would say remarkably so. Tell us about your life now.
Okay. Well, can I back up a little bit?
Please, yes.
Okay. Going back to my teenage years, my family was very active in church, and so we were in church all the time, and I was in an active youth program, and we did a lot of things youth-wise, and when I was about 17, I made the decision that I wanted to do what the Lord wanted me to do. I think it was at that time, although I had made an initial conversion experience earlier, it wasn't until then that I truly learned what it was to let the Lord be the Lord, let Jesus be Lord of my life. And so I told him in a service one time that I wanted to do what he wanted me to do. We used to call that surrendering to special service.
Right.
It's I haven't heard that term in a long time. I don't think people call it that anymore. But anyway, I had finished. This was in the interim, the time since I'd graduated from high school already, but had not yet committed to going to college. Oh, I might say this is sort of interesting maybe. I worked at First National Bank in downtown Dallas for 2 years. I worked in the credit department. I would spend all day checking people's credit references, the kinds of things that took hours and hours then. Now someone can do it sitting at a computer in a few minutes.
A couple clicks of the mouse.
Yeah. Anyway, so things have changed a lot since those years. But anyway, it was during that time when I had this job that those 2 years were good. I think God gave me those years because it was a growing up time for me. I told you that when I graduated from high school, and you said I was advanced. Well, I don't know that. Maybe in some ways, but in other ways I was not. And I wasn't ready to leave home. I wasn't ready to really seek God's will for my life. I had to grow into that. And so I think that was a growing time for me. And so when I went to college then, I went with that in mind, seeking to do God's will for my life. Well, back then, this was in the 50s still, and there weren't very many places for women in ministry. There were very few. Only the very large churches had children's directors back then, and they were mostly men. The earliest, first children's directors I knew anything about were men.
Wow.
So I never felt led into missions. In college, many of the girls, my friends, felt called to missions, and so they knew where they were going. And they had that in mind, and I never felt like God wanted me to be a missionary. I just didn't know. I mean, it was a process by which I just sort of had to learn. And so I wouldn't recommend people go to college the way I went to college, in that I didn't have a lot of plans in mind. So I think I majored in 3 or 4 different things. I mean, I would, major in one thing and no, that's not right, and something else and something else. So by the time, and I really did graduate, I graduated the same time Dan did by staying, the 4th and 4 years and a couple of summers we had gone. But I had far more hours than I needed. I'd accumulated a lot of hours. However, they were in education. I completed all those education courses to be an all-level music teacher. I had all that. But I never felt like God wanted me to be a teacher, nor did he want me to be a missionary. So it just kind of worked out that, and it never would have occurred to me that God wanted me to marry a minister. But that's how it turned out, actually.
Sure.
And so God has a way of working things out when we just let go and let him have his way. But it took me a while to learn that. I was really trying to be helpful, and he was just waiting for me to just, be still and listen.
I understand.
Okay, so with that background then of wanting to be a servant and wanting to have a ministry, after Dan was no longer here, I felt like, I couldn't. At first, of course, I didn't know why God would take him and leave me. And that made no sense to me at all. He was the one with the ministry, and I was the background person who didn't have, and which I still am. I mean, I am. I like being in the background, but I realize that if as long as we're here, there's something for us to do. God would not have left me here had there not been something that I was supposed to do. And I love being busy in church and doing various things. And
So, tell me about your church life. What are you heavy into? What's your thing?
well, of course, at my age, I'm into senior adult things.
Sure. And recently was honored with the Senior Adult Woman of the Year, which is a great recognition.
Well-
it's a recognition because it comes from your peers, and that you're.
Well, I was very humbled by that, but I felt very honored at the same time to have been chosen.
Sure.
It was very nice, and I'm appreciative of that. But in addition to that, I teach first grade and Sunday school.
Sure.
And I love working, with the little children. Of course, I've always loved music since, that's what my degree was in. And so I like singing in the choir.
Sure.
And so I'm involved in, music kind of things. And I play the piano nowadays for the senior adult choir, which we call the Grand Central Singers.
Yes, of course, and it's very grand. So, tell me now at this stage of life, when you look back upon what you've been through, what would you tell somebody? Because very few people have been down your path. What would you tell somebody that has, as you look back on that, about give me a pearl of wisdom that you would say to somebody, maybe a girl who is in college and is changing majors, or a girl that's kind of wondering what's happening in the world.
Joe, I don't feel very wise at all. I don't know that I have any pearls of wisdom. I've learned that it takes a great dependence on the Lord. If you put your faith and trust in Him, He doesn't fail you. Things will happen that you don't understand, but I think He doesn't expect us to understand everything. We just have to accept it, knowing that He knows what's best for us.
Well, now that's a pearl of wisdom. That's good,
Oh,
Barbara.
okay.
That's good. Well, I thank you for being here today. It's we've talked about a lot of stuff, and is there anything that I missed that you'd like to talk about that you think is that I should have asked about that I didn't?
I can't think of anything,
Well,
but I appreciate your inviting me.
well, I'm glad you did, and hopefully this is something that people will get to be able to look at this and get to know you better. So many people know the Dan McBride story, but they don't know the Barbara McBride story. So I'm glad to be able to tell that and tell how you've been able to. You've been again as I've gotten into the family. I had no clue about Dan. I knew about Becky. That's what I liked. I thought that was the greatest part, and still do. But as I've gotten into the family and known what's going on, I wanted to be able to interview you because really, Dan wouldn't have been Dan without Barbara. It's true. What I mean by that, he had a great voice and great everything, but you were the glue that kept that whole thing together. And I mean, you don't go 35, 40 years of a ministry and not have that. And so it's a neat thing as I look back on it. I think that there's a lot of people that are going to hear this podcast and be able to put that knowledge in as they look at you now and look at what you do now, and I think that they're going to be able to see that really you provided a strength for the family and a strength for Dan's ministry, and anyway, it's a neat thing.
I might say before we go that I've talked a lot about how Dan did humorous songs, wrote many humorous songs and things which people really loved, but he was a very seriously trained singer with a great voice, and so many people in Central remember his singing, and
Sure.
he had a great ministry in that as well.
Oh, yeah, matter of fact, he had one of the things that I'm really glad occurred was right before Dan's death. If I remember right, he died in March of 2002. I think it was in February that Nathan brought you and Dan and made a CD of his what we called strong songs, or we called it something like that. The songs he would end his performances with that just had that big, deep, just resonating voice, and he could sing those kind of songs better than anybody that I know. And y'all recorded so many of those. And that CD, I know I've got several copies. I know you probably have some too. If somebody ever wanted one, that is available. That meaning that we could figure out a way to get that to somebody if they really wanted it to. I know we could get that to the church, and so there's all sorts of things of Dan and you playing and him singing.
Well, that is available. I regret that we never got it properly mixed.
Yeah.
And so it's still kind of in a rough form.
Yeah.
But
it's in a digital form, which means it'll be around for, it's not like a cassette that's going to go bad or anything of this nature. It's digitized, which is really neat. But it does need to be mixed. It does need to be, made more professional in terms of its output. But still, every time I give one of those CDs out to somebody, they love it. So hopefully somebody will listen to this. You might get a request or two. We'll have to see. Barbara, thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of this, and thank you for being a part of Pod Central.
Well, thank you.